Hello and welcome to Living History, coming at you from a very cold and soggy Villers-Bretonneux on the Somme. It's currently the 12th of November, the day after Remembrance Day, and I wanted to take this opportunity to share with you my recollections of a really special Remembrance Day spent on the Somme. So there were a lot of Australians here. There was probably about between 1,500 and 2,000 Australians who turned up and braved the arduous weather conditions to commemorate the centenary of Remembrance Day at Villers-Bretonneux on the Somme. And the service was held at the Australian National Memorial. Now, this is a magnificent memorial right in the heart of the Somme on the Villers-Bretonneux battlefield. And it's significant because Villers-Bretonneux, the great attack that took place in April 1918, was considered one of Australia's most important actions on the Western Front. And after the war, when we were looking for a place to build our national memorial, Villers-Bretonneux made a lot of sense. And there's a big hill just north of the town called Hill 104, and it was there that we decided that our national memorial should be built. And it had a little bit of a checkered history. Construction was begun during the Great Depression. It struggled for funding for a while. So it wasn't completed until 1938, which it was the last of the great national memorials to be constructed on the Western Front, and less than a year before the outbreak of the Second World War, of course. So the timing wasn't great for the poor old National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. But the memorial is really quite spectacular. It records the names of nearly 11,000 Australians missing from fighting in France. And it's really important that we understand what that means. These are not 11,000 men killed in fighting in France. This is just the missing. So it's absolutely extraordinary to stand there and see these thousands and thousands of Australian names across this great memorial. And also carved in the memorial are the battles that are most famous in Australian history on the Western Front. So a really remarkable sight. And the memorial itself suffered damage during the Second World War. The Germans strafed it and sent a tank crashing through the cemetery. And so there's still damage today on the memorial, which I think just adds to the story. They've deliberately left the damage on the memorial. They haven't repaired it. And I think that tells an important part of the story about the fighting that returned to the Somme area so soon after the First World War. So this was the site for Remembrance Day yesterday, and it's the site where all of our major commemorative events are held in France to commemorate the First World War. So it's where Anzac Day is held every year. We've seen a number of very big and important commemorative events take place there over the past several years to commemorate the centenaries of the First World War. And unlike Anzac Day, this was not a dawn service. This service was going to be held at 11 a.m. to commemorate the moment that the guns fell silent on the Western Front. And a lot of people ask that question, why 11 a.m.? Why did the fighting end on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month? And really, it was a combination of just coincidence, but also the people behind the Armistice saw the symmetry in the 11th of the 11th of the 11th. So the negotiations about the Armistice had been taking place for several weeks. The Germans knew they were going to lose the war. They'd come to the bargaining table to negotiate an end to the fighting, and this took place over several weeks in a place called Compiègne, just north of Paris, in a train carriage down at Compiègne. And they finally reached agreement. The Allies and the Germans reached a final agreement in the very early hours of 11 November and signed the agreement and decided that was the day that the fighting should end. And because communications were so poor at this time, they wanted to allow enough time for the message to get to the men at the front. So they determined that, okay, at 11 a.m., noting the symmetry of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, we'll end the fighting. So the message went out to all the men that at 11 a.m., drop your guns, lay down your arms, and the war will come to an end. And most people took this as an opportunity. Most commanders on the spot took this as an opportunity to tell their men to keep their heads down and just wait for 11 a.m. to tick over when the fighting would stop. But some commanders, unfortunately, took this as an opportunity to have one last dig at the Germans, and several attacks were launched in the final hours of the war, in those hours leading up to November 11, and several hundred men were unfortunately killed in those moments leading up to the 11 a.m. deadline to end the fighting. So really tragic. The last great tragedy of a war absolutely filled with tragedy. So that was the story of how the Armistice came about. And so now here we are 100 years later. There were commemorations right across France, throughout the UK, in Germany, really everywhere that there'd been involvement in this great conflict countries were remembering it coming to an end. You would have seen on the news that Donald Trump was out here representing the Americans. Rather controversially, chose not to go to a cemetery that he had been originally intended to go to. But he was in France for those commemorative services. And we should remember the Americans in this whole process as well, because even though they came into the war very, very late, the Americans did play a major role. And something that I always like to remind people of is the largest battle in US military history was not during the Civil War, was not D-Day. The largest operation Americans have ever been involved in was the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne in 1918 here on the Western Front. 1.2 million Americans took part in that campaign. So absolutely extraordinary, the scale of what was happening here on the Western Front. And it's important we remember the Americans, quite frankly, because the Americans don't remember the Americans. Very few Americans come to this part of the world. Very few Americans remember their First World War history. They're very focused on their Second World War history, as they should be. But it's a shame that Americans don't remember the fighting on the Western Front as much as they should, because they participated in some huge battles and lost a lot of very good men. So that's the story that led to Remembrance Day. And at the Australian National Memorial, as I said, between 1,500 and 2,000 Aussies braved the weather. It was very cold. It was very rainy. But it was a good service. It was a fairly standard service. I have to say, look, I enjoyed being there for the event. It was wonderful to be on the ground for that time. But I'm going to go on the record as saying I don't get a lot out of these commemorative services. They have fallen into a very standardised routine, in my opinion. And I've been to a lot of them now, starting with Gallipoli in 2015, Fromelles and Pozières in 2016, on through 2017, and of course now several in 2018, including Anzac Day this year. And the commemorative services, I think, leave a little bit to be desired. They're all organised exactly the same. They have the same masters of ceremony. They have the same formula. You get a politician standing up making a speech, generally getting his or her facts very wrong about what they're talking about. A hymn, a dedication from a chaplain, someone speaking in French. It's all very much the same, I've got to say. And then the last post, minute silence and Reveille. I suppose it's fine. It's a tried and true formula, but it lacks emotion to me. What I'd love to see in these commemorative services is some sort of emotion. When I sit there amongst this crowd and you look around, I certainly don't feel emotional. It's quite stirring when the last post plays, of course, out over the battlefield. But I look around and not too many people are choked up with emotion by these events. They tend to just participate in the service, stand up when they're told to stand up, sing the hymns, listen to the last post. So I'd love to see a way for us to add more emotion and more human elements to these commemorative services. And ways we could do that, for example, how incredible would it be to hear, for example, from the sister of someone who was killed in Vietnam? I mean, a family member from someone who died in Vietnam. How amazing would that be? What about a veteran? Let's get a veteran to stand up and talk about what remembrance means to them and what it means to have served and to be part of the whole Anzac legend. We don't get people like that to participate in commemorative services. What we get is politicians. And I'm not quite sure when politicians became the standard bearers for remembrance. They do it very, very poorly. And they don't represent me. I don't get excited when the Deputy Minister for Flower Arranging stands up to talk about his views on the Western Front. It's a strange thing to me. But anyway, I won't go on about it. That's my 2 cents worth about commemorative services. I'd love to see more emotion and more connection with the history in these services. But it was a standard commemorative service. It was a lovely moment to be there at 11 a.m. They didn't do anything particularly special for 11 a.m. except for the last post. I was hoping there'd be something a little bit more engaging in this incredible moment when the guns fell silent. But it was good. It was a nice service, and the people there certainly enjoyed it, and my hat's off to the people who were there, because it was some tough conditions in the rain. And it's always wonderful being at Villers-Bretonneux and looking up at that memorial and seeing those names of all those missing Australians, and to walk through the cemetery there reading the headstones of the men who died and are now buried at Villers-Bretonneux. So I strongly recommend that if you are taking a trip to Europe, spend the extra time to come up to the battlefields and spend a couple of days just walking in the footsteps of the Aussies. You'll be really glad you did. So that was really my Remembrance Day. I just wanted to share those recollections with you. It was a lovely day to be here. It was a fitting end to the centenary commemorations. I'm not sure what will happen now, how remembrance will change now the centenaries are over. This has been such a big part of my life for the past 4 years now. I'm not really sure how to feel about the fact that the centenaries are over. I hope that it remains very important to Australians. I certainly feel that it will. And I hope that Australians can keep the torch burning and keep remembering the Anzacs the way that they have done over the last 4 years, because there's so much wonderful history for us to learn and so many wonderful stories for us to recount about what these men went through. So it's a really important time of our history, and I hope that it remains important to Australians of today. So that's my few words about my Remembrance Day here in France. I feel very privileged to have been here, and thank you to everyone who came up and spoke to me while you were here as well, and to the people who weren't fortunate enough to be here. I hope you had a memorable Remembrance Day back home in Australia or wherever you were. Coming up on the podcast in the coming weeks, I'm not going to be as frequent with the podcast as I have been. I know you haven't heard from me for a little while, and apologies for that, but it's for good reason. I've just been so busy in the lead up to Remembrance Day, planning everything that we're doing over here in France. And in the coming weeks and months, I'm working really hard to generate some excellent content. So you may not hear as much from me towards the latter part of this year, but that's so that when I come back in the new year with some absolutely amazing content, we'll have some great podcasts to share with you. So over the next couple of days, I'm staying up here on the Somme and going to Ypres and filming some mini little documentaries for Living History TV. So look out for those. Got great interviews coming up with veterans, really great stories coming up in the podcast and through the YouTube channel. So look out for those in the coming weeks and months. As always, keep sending me your feedback, your correspondence. I love getting your emails and your tweets. Follow me on Twitter. Send a message through Facebook. I love hearing from you all, and I try to reply as much as I can to people and to incorporate your suggestions into the podcast. So thank you very much for listening to the podcast. Thank you for listening to my comments about Remembrance Day, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next episode.